The 911 call transcripts were obtained via a public right-to-know request that happened to coincide with CrimeCon, but had nothing to do with CrimeCon. It was sent back in February, and we just got them back in May.
Right, so it took, how many months is that? 3 months for them to respond?
So what I was able to learn, like, sort of during the back and forth of our communications about the calls was that there were 3 calls between, I guess what I'll call the public, and dispatchers regarding Maura's accident. So 2 of them were released. The first one was Faith Westman's call, and the second one was Butch Atwood's call. The third is the call back from dispatch to Barbara Atwood. That one is still not being released. And I'm trying to get clarification on why that's the case. So let's go over Faith Westman's call.
Sure.
All right, so the timestamp on Westman's call was 7:27 p.m., as we pretty much knew, and the length of the call was 1 minute and 18 seconds. So this one, unlike Atwood's, went directly to Grafton County. So there really isn't anything in here that we didn't already assume that Westman told dispatch.
Right.
Of course, there's 2 lines, complete lines, that are redacted.
Yes, so what I've tried to do with these lines is sort of infer what they might have been about based on the conversation that occurred around them. So, like, what would naturally be occurring in that space. So the first one is pretty early in the conversation. It's actually the third thing that Faith says. They asked if anyone was hurt. She says, "I've not gone out to investigate." They say, "Okay," kind of cutting her off a little bit, and then she says something else. And then the dispatcher immediately follows up with, you're in Bath, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So that could imply they're talking about the location.
Yeah, or it's the comment about the man in the vehicle smoking a cigarette.
Right, because it is after she asked about if anyone was hurt. By Rhonda Marsh, she was asked about the occupants of the car, in a sense. So that would be a place where you might state that, I haven't gone out to investigate, okay, but I can see a man in the car smoking a cigarette.
But Faith, there are 2 actual sentences that are redacted.
Well, one I think we can surmise.
We think it might be the smoking cigarette.
Yeah, man in the car smoking a cigarette, probably redacted. Well, I don't want to speculate why it's redacted. I don't know. We don't think it's true, but it was redacted.
Right. But we know that they argued about that at some point.
Right. Yeah, the Westmans themselves.
The Westmans
Tim
argued
and
about
Faith.
that. But I think what's most interesting is that we now know that Faith was not on the phone the whole time until the police arrived, which was a pretty big question. If she saw Butch pull up, that could be what the last thing says, that she sees him pull up.
Yeah.
We don't know.
And we know that in the logs, Rhonda Marsh says that she gives a very specific description from the caller of the way the car was. She said it was in the westbound lane facing west?
Yeah, was in eastbound, but ended up in westbound ditch facing westbound.
Right. And if you look at Faith Westman's, it's like 3 lines that are redacted. That kind of makes sense. It's kind of complicated to explain, because I doubt she said westbound or eastbound. So that might take a lot of words because it's kind of hard to describe.
Yeah. And so, and correct me if I'm wrong, my logic is off here, but I think those have to be the 2 things that are redacted, because we know that they were communicated because they're in the dispatch log and they're not anywhere else in the transcript. I think Atwood's call is a little bit more interesting.
Yes.
And so again, he called 911 and couldn't get through to Grafton County. So he spoke to the 911 dispatcher who routed his call to Hanover. So that's why his call was approximately 3 minutes, which is about twice as long as Faith Westman's, but it's about the same length.
Yeah, roughly the same number of words.
Mm-hmm. So whatever he said to the 911 dispatcher, we actually do not have the transcript of that.
But it was probably pretty mundane.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think that there was a question about whether this was Atwood's call to 911 or whether it was the call back from dispatchers. And it was the call to 911, again, that was routed to Hanover. And this is the Hanover portion of their conversation. And just to give the timestamp of the call, Atwood called 911 at 7:42.
This is a 3-minute call, so at this point it's probably 7:43.
Yes, and in the dispatch log it says at 7:43.
So let's go through it.
I mean, I think the first thing that jumps out when you read Atwood's transcript is that he says he hit a pine tree.
Yes. Well, the first thing that jumps out to me is he says, "Good evening, is this Grafton County?" So he's not even aware that he's been given Hanover.
Yeah.
But then, yes, he says his name, and he says where he is, which is redacted. The road he's on. And this is weird to me, because they redact the road name and the town, but then he says, up by the weathered barn. Well, we know exactly where he is based on the weathered barn. Like, why wouldn't you have redacted but then it gets into like, well, it's ridiculous because we all know where this guy lives. We all know where Faith Westman lives. Like, this is not a secret. Like, why are you bothering to redact it? But
yeah, but again, I think it goes back to them, applying the letter of the law.
This is, while at first glance you can look at it and say it doesn't have much significance, but it is something that's been dangling out there for a long time. This Butch Atwood call and what was exactly talked about during that phone call.
yeah, all right. So he says single car motor vehicle accident. So he says there's one car. So there's really no room for there to be another car at the time that Butch Atwood saw it. And then, yeah, he hit a pine tree, airbag is deployed.
Mm-hmm. So there's actually kind of a lot of information in this little snippet. The fact that he says he hit a pine tree, I do think that was probably either a misstatement or like a function of the transcription.
Yeah, because we know he said he spoke to a girl.
Yeah, later on he says a single female. The second thing he says is about the pine tree, which I do find really interesting because Monahan also mentioned in his narrative statement that the driver hit a tree.
He did. Now, he could have been going from what he heard on the radio, because we know that he was listening to chatter on the radio about information that was coming in via the phone. So he might have heard from Atwood that the driver hit a pine tree or hit a tree. But again, it's dark. He's probably not inspecting too carefully. He doesn't see any vehicles around that she could have hit, so he's going to assume.
It looks like it could possibly be a tree hit.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it doesn't look like it could at all possibly be a tree, but to the untrained eye, someone not really think about it in any way whatsoever, just that they see damage, yeah, you're going to assume probably is a tree, because like what the hell else would someone hit?
Mm-hmm.
You hit a snowbank, it's going to destroy the snowbank, the car might get stuck, it's not going to usually destroy the front of your car hitting a snowbank, so you're probably going to assume tree.
Right. Yeah, I would really like to get the accident photos for this reason. Side note, they are not releasing them at this time, citing that they are investigatory in nature.
Right. The more likely explanation is it's a sharp corner. She lost control going too fast around a sharp corner.
Right. And I mean, I think that Atwood actually speaks to that in his call. He says she's shaken up, no blood that I see, but the airbag was deployed, heavy damage. It's right on the bad corner near the weathered barns.
One other thing I think is interesting here, and what's interesting to me is what is not the case about this transcript, which is that the very long section where he talks about she's shaken up, no blood, airbag deployed, describing the location, that is not redacted. And earlier we were talking about Faith Westman's call and the possibility, maybe they're just overzealous with the redaction and they're redacting anything that they think might be important. Well, by that same logic, I would think that section would have been redacted. Because it seems to be it's a similar sort of description, right? He's talking about what he saw at the scene and the specific location, which was presumably one of the sections redacted on Faith Westman's call, which he's talking about the position of the vehicle. And yet, in her case, it was entirely redacted. Here, that whole section of Butch Atwood's call is not.
Yeah, I agree. I think the one thing I would say, though, is that Atwood is describing the same location. He's using a lot of words to basically say at the weathered barn corner.
Yes. That's true. He doesn't specify the orientation of the car, for example.
Right. Whereas Westman
But he does say he sees the airbag deployed. He does say damage. He does say no blood. If I was being very cautious with redaction, I would have thought I maybe would have redacted that, especially the part about the airbag being deployed.
That's really interesting. I had always assumed that the 7:43 timestamp was actually dispatch calling back Barbara Atwood. But it seems as though that didn't happen until some point later. So probably the next couple of minutes. I think that she logged that call or that narrative at 7:48. So she probably called back pretty soon after, 7:46, 7:47, something like that.
Yep.
So if Atwood was calling 911 at 7:42, he, at that point, had no reason to believe that police were already there.
Right, because he doesn't mention that. He wouldn't have called if police were already there, presumably.
Right. Now, is it possible that he called and didn't know that police were there? I guess.
It is possible. However, we know that the crash site is visible from there, so it'd be easy enough for him to check, or to be looking kind of at the scene as he makes the call. That doesn't mean he did necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then also, I'm looking at the Caledonian record from February 20th,
Okay.
where he is quoted as saying, it says, while he was talking on his phone on his front porch, Atwood could see the road but not Maura's disabled car. He saw several
Interesting.
vehicles drive by, but couldn't tell any of the makes or models because it was so dark. After about 7 to 9 minutes, he looked out and saw the Haverhill police.
Ah, interesting. So, yeah, to me that suggests while he's on the phone, there are no police there, because he would definitely see the blue lights reflecting off the trees and stuff in the area. If he can see the road, he's on his porch, he can see cars, he's going to see those lights.
But that still would start at 7:42, though.
That would be starting at 7:42. That's true, if that was the case. So he'd pretty much have to be completely wrong in order for the police to have been there at 7:42. He would just have to be totally wrong about having been on his porch, I think. Or the police didn't have their lights on. Smith showed up and didn't have his lights on, which I find impossible to believe because that is just straight up dangerous. So yeah, if his lights are on and if Butch Atwood's on the porch when he initiates that phone call, there is no police car there at that time.
Monahan says, while I was headed there, I heard Cecil Smith call off that he'd arrived on the scene, and so I continued on because I heard there was also like a play-by-play that dispatch was telling him as we were both going to the area, and I could overhear Grafton County talking to him, and it was the caller saying, well, I don't see her anymore. They initially, I believe, said there's a woman by the car, and then I think they said she's not there anymore. Or when Cecil got there, I don't really recall that part, said she's not here anymore. And then later on in the interview, Art asks, I know a lot of times SOP, standard operating procedure, for 911 calls is the standard procedure. You would keep the individual on the line until a unit either showed up on scene or came to the door. Was that what was occurring here? John's response was, I think they did because I believe it would have been a conversation. There's a White House on the corner, and I believe that was the caller. And so it was a conversation between them and whoever the dispatcher was that evening. And so I do believe that, and I don't know for sure, but I believe I remember them hearing the officers here. They could see the blue lights or something to that effect. But I do remember there was a brief snippet of a conversation that occurred.
Yeah, he mentioned the blue lights twice. He hedges a lot, but he says that twice. So that, to me, means that he's specifically remembering the caller mentioning the blue lights.
Yep. Now, he sort of assumes that this was Westman communicating this information.
Right, but he wouldn't really know, necessarily.
Yeah. And his prior statement about them initially saying that there was a woman by the car, but then she's not there anymore, this seems to line up or correspond exactly to what's in the dispatch log about dispatch's call with Barbara Atwood when they called her back.
Right, they say in the narrative on the call with Barbara that she has no idea where the female is. So that indicates they were talking about the girl in the car on Barbara's call. And the police were asking if she knew where she was, which, yeah, like you said, kind of dovetails with John's, Monahan's statement that he overheard that she's not there anymore. So, it's true that the caller did see blue lights, and it was almost certainly Barbara. She can see blue lights from the house. So it's not like they couldn't have known, that Butch Atwood couldn't have known that the police were there earlier. He absolutely could have.
So that would have been around 7:46, 7.
Right, based on the time of entry of that narrative statement, which was 7:48.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that, I'm trying to picture this happening now, because he's saying that, Smith was in communication with dispatch at the time that they were also getting information. In fact, he said he could hear the caller, so he could hear the woman over the radio. So they're piping the conversation over the radio. So to me, what that means is, and this is a bit of assumption, but it does line up, Smith called in to dispatch saying, hey, there's nobody here. And dispatch either had just called back Barbara or then was prompted to call back the Atwoods to get more information, because their officer on scene is telling them, hey, there's no one here. And so they wanted to find out, like, hey, did you see her? So that's when they put the call directly into the radio, or close enough to the radio where Smith could hear, so that he could hear directly what the witness was saying about the status from their vantage point. That makes total sense. And to me, what makes the most sense is that it happens right after Smith gets there and looks around the car. 7:46. 7:45, he gets there. 7:46, he's looked around the car, there's no one there. He calls in. 7:47, they're talking to Barbara. Short conversation probably would help to have that call, and then they enter it in the logs after that.
And then he goes over to the Westmans and says, "Where's the girl?" I mean, to me, this is more evidence that Smith probably arrived around 7:45 or 7:46.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say it adds more data points that are consistent with the 7:46 arrival, which is just more data points that you have to explain away to get an earlier arrival time. Doesn't, unfortunately, definitively prove anything, but it certainly matches up very nicely with Cecil Smith arriving around 7:45.
Right. Matches up perfectly, in fact.
Yeah. You know, it's to the point where I'm like, I gotta go back myself and look at witness A, Karen McNamara, and say, like, did she really see what she saw, what she said she saw? And is that timestamp that we have on her cell phone call really saying what we think it is? Because, goddamn, it really looks like, if that's all true, there was another police officer on scene. Like, I can't come up with another plausible explanation.
Yeah, I can't either. I do believe, like, it is more likely to me, having all these data points, that witness A is wrong than Smith showed up at 7:35. That's way more likely to me.
Yeah, it's much easier to just say witness A must be wrong.
Yeah, it's possible, but, like, is it a coincidence that she saw an SUV and they're saying that he was in an SUV? That's pretty coincidental.
Yeah.
If she's wrong. And to have been so consistent about it for so many years, even after being told that she was wrong.
Yeah.
So I guess the one last thing I would say about the 7:42 timestamp, and a question that's from the dispatch log that's sort of been out there for a long time, is why did they wait, 15 minutes or so to dispatch fire and EMS?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they did so at 7:42 and 30 seconds suggests to me that it was a function of the 911 call from Atwood. So that's what I'm going to say almost certainly prompted them to dispatch fire and EMS that time.